On a heavy snowy night in the town of Maple Hollow, a little girl and her loyal German shepherd stumbled upon a sight no child should ever witness. By the iron fence near her home, a man lay unconscious in the snow. His body was nearly frozen, yet in his arms he held a tiny German shepherd puppy, no more than 15 days old, clinging to its life with the last warmth he had to give. Why would a stranger risk everything in a storm just to protect a fragile life? This is where the story begins. Before we continue, let me ask you, where are you watching from? Share it in the comments, and if you believe in stories of silent heroes and second chances, make sure to subscribe so you never miss one. Wishing you a day filled with hope and light. The storm had settled heavily over Maple Hollow, a small American town surrounded by pine-covered hills that now lay buried beneath waves of snow. It was late at night, the kind of night when shutters rattled against icy winds and chimneys puffed smoke into a frozen sky, the streets long deserted. Inside one modest wooden house, warmth glowed faintly through frosted windows where a little girl, only 5 years old, leaned against her crutches by the hearth. Her name was Emily Evans, a child marked by both fragility and quiet resilience, for she had lost one leg in an accident early in life and now moved with a metallic prosthetic and a pair of small crutches that seemed almost too large for her tiny arms. She lived here with her mother, Laura, a gentle but cautious woman, and with Rex, her German shepherd, whose watchful amber eyes seldom missed a sound in the night. The wind moaned through the trees and the snow piled against the steps outside when Rex suddenly stiffened, ears pricked, tail frozen in alertness. He was 6 years old, strong in frame and sure-footed, his black and tan coat gleaming even in dim light, a dog trained by no one but sharpened by instinct, especially sensitive to the cries of his own kind. Tonight, that instinct caught something faint, so faint that only a dog like him could have heard it, an almost broken whimper carried on the storm's breath. Emily noticed his sudden posture and frowned, tilting her head. "What is it, Rex?" she whispered, but the dog gave no answer, only a short bark and a scratch at the door, demanding to be let out. Emily hesitated, for her mother had warned her about the storm, yet curiosity and the sight of Rex's urgency pushed her forward. She gripped her crutches tightly, shuffled to the door, and with an effort pulled it open against the push of snow and wind. The air bit into her cheeks like 1,000 needles, the night so white that the earth and sky blurred together. Rex darted out immediately, barking once, then glanced back, urging her to follow. With small, determined steps, Emily made her way across the yard, each swing of her crutches planting in the deep snow. She was frightened, but more curious, trusting Rex more than her own judgment. Not far from the wooden fence that lined the property, her eyes caught sight of something that did not belong to the still whiteness. At first it looked like a mound of snow, but as she drew closer, the shape of a man's body emerged, broad-shouldered, slumped against the iron rails, his form half buried. Rex barked sharply, circling the figure, nose pressed against the man's chest, as if urging Emily to see what he already knew. Emily's heart pounded as she steadied herself and peered down. A man lay there, unconscious, his breath shallow and uneven, his face pale under the frost. He looked to be in his early 40s, his hair dark with streaks of silver, a strong jaw now slack with exhaustion. But what froze Emily in awe was not. Only the man himself. Nestled tightly within his thick coat, clutched close to his chest, was a tiny German shepherd puppy, barely old enough to open its eyes fully, its fur soft and fragile, no more than 15 days old. The little creature whimpered weakly, and Emily realized with shock that the man had been using his own body heat to keep it alive. She gasped, eyes wide, her small hands trembling on the wooden grips of her crutches. This stranger, a man she had never seen before, had collapsed in the storm not because he sought to save himself, but because he was shielding a helpless life from the merciless cold. Emily did not know what to do at first. She had never been this close to danger, never seen a person lying motionless as snow covered his shoulders. But she understood one thing with the clarity only children possess. If she did nothing, both the man and the puppy would not last long. "Mama!" she shouted suddenly, her thin voice swallowed quickly by the wind. Panic rose in her chest as she struggled to turn back toward the house. Rex barked in agreement, his body circling Emily protectively as if guiding her return. She began the difficult trek back, her crutches sinking into snow, but fear lent her speed. Inside, Laura Evans was already moving toward the door, alarmed by her daughter's cries. She was a woman in her mid-30s, her frame shaped by years of quiet endurance, her face marked by worry but softened by love. She pushed past the wind and met Emily halfway, the girl breathless and pointing with urgency. "Mama, a man! He's out there! He's hurt!" Laura's heart thudded as she pulled her daughter close, then looked to Rex, who barked insistently, urging them to follow. Without wasting more time, Laura wrapped her shawl tighter and hurried with Emily back toward the fence. When they reached the spot, Laura's breath caught at the sight before her. The man looked lifeless, his lips bluish, snow tangled in his hair. She knelt quickly, pressing a hand against his cheek, then gasped when she felt the faint but undeniable warmth of something moving inside his coat. Gently she pulled the fabric aside, and there, against his chest, the tiny puppy whimpered again. Laura's eyes widened. This was not a man who had simply collapsed drunk or lost. This was someone who had chosen to give his own warmth to save another. She exchanged a look with Emily, and the child's eyes, wide and shimmering, reflected the same wonder and fear. Together, with effort that seemed too much for two small figures against the storm, Laura and Emily managed to lift the man's weight from the snow. He was heavy, his body limp, but Laura's determination and Emily's stubborn insistence gave them strength. Rex pressed against his side, lending balance as they half-carried, half-dragged the man toward the house. Emily, though trembling from cold, kept her gaze on the small bundle of fur in his coat, whispering softly to calm the puppy, as though her voice alone might keep it alive. By the time they stumbled back into the warmth of their home, their breaths were ragged, their limbs aching, but relief washed over them. The stranger was inside, safe from the storm, the puppy still cradled against him. The fire in the hearth crackled as Laura laid the man gently down on a rug near the flames. She pulled the puppy free from his coat, wrapped it in a soft towel, and placed it carefully beside the fire, where its tiny chest rose and fell with fragile rhythm. Emily crouched close, her eyes wide, whispering to the small creature while Rex lay protectively at her side. Laura checked the man's pulse, faint but steady, and adjusted the blankets over him. His features, though gaunt from hardship, carried strength. He was no ordinary wanderer. The scars on his hands, the stiffness in his posture, even while unconscious, spoke of a soldier's life. Emily leaned closer, curiosity outweighing fear. Her voice was hushed but full of wonder. "Mama, he saved it. He saved the puppy." Laura's expression softened, her heart tugged by the sight of her daughter's amazement. She brushed a strand of hair from Emily's face and nodded slowly. "Yes, sweetheart. He gave what he had left to protect it." In that moment, the storm outside raged on, but inside, warmth spread not just from the fire, but from the unspoken understanding that they had brought into their home not only a stranger in need, but a man who had chosen compassion even in his darkest hour. And so, the night in Maple Hollow carried with it a question that settled in Emily's young heart and would not leave her. Why would a man she had never known risk his very life to shelter a fragile creature in the snow? The image of him collapsed against the fence, shielding the puppy with his last strength, would linger as both mystery and inspiration, the first spark of a story yet to unfold. Morning broke slowly over Maple Hollow, the storm easing into a quiet gray sky as soft light slipped through the frosted windows of Laura Evans's modest kitchen. The fire in the hearth had burned low through the night, leaving a glow that painted the wooden walls with a dull warmth. On the rug near the flames, under a heavy blanket and with bandages hastily wrapped around his hands, the man who had collapsed in the snow stirred. His breaths, once shallow and ragged, grew steadier, and his eyelids fluttered open to reveal dark, weary eyes that carried both pain and resolve. Emily was already awake, perched on a small chair with her crutches leaning beside her, while Rex lay protectively by the man's side, his head resting against the floorboards, ears twitching at every movement. The stranger tried to rise, but the weakness in his body pulled him back down, his voice emerging in a low rasp. Laura, standing at the kitchen counter preparing hot broth, turned quickly, her expression wary yet undeniably relieved that he was conscious. He was tall, broad-shouldered even in his exhaustion, with hair dark brown streaked faintly with silver, and a face roughened by stubble and weather, the sort of face marked by long exposure to both hardship and discipline. Though his body showed the toll of the storm, there was an unmistakable strength in the set of his jaw and the faint lines near his eyes, reminders of a soldier's years. "You're safe now," Laura said carefully, her tone both gentle and guarded. "You're in my home. You collapsed outside." The man closed his eyes briefly, nodding as if piecing together what had happened. When he spoke again, his words were halting but steady. "My name is Jack," he managed, his voice hoarse. "Jack Carter. I didn't mean to bring trouble here." Emily tilted her head, her small fingers clutched around the handle of her crutch, eyes wide as though the name itself meant little but the man's presence meant everything. Rex gave a soft whine and nudged closer, pressing his body against Jack's side in an almost instinctive act of solidarity, as if recognizing something familiar in him. Jack's weary lips curved faintly in the ghost of a smile, his hand weakly brushing against the dog's fur. Laura moved closer, crouching down to meet his gaze. "You were holding a puppy when we found you. Why would you be out there in a storm like that, nearly frozen to death?" Her voice carried suspicion beneath the concern, the guarded instinct of a mother protecting her child. Jack shifted against the blanket, his eyes flicking toward the hearth where the tiny German shepherd pup now lay curled on a towel, its fragile chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. The sight seemed to steady him, to remind him why he had been out there at all. He drew a long breath, then began, his voice quiet but firm despite his weakness. "I stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see," he said slowly. "There's a group out there in the woods beyond town. They're not hunters, not farmers. They're men who trade in lives, dogs taken, caged, treated like property. They had dozens of them locked in iron crates, cold, starving." His eyes darkened with the memory, his hands balling weakly into fists. "I couldn't just walk away. I tried to free one of them, just one, and I got this little pup out of the cage. But they caught me before I could do more." His voice roughened as he exhaled, the weight of failure pressing against every word. Laura stiffened, her brows furrowing, lips pressed into a tight line. Her cautious nature made her question the truth. Why would a stranger risk his own life for animals, and why here, so close to her home? She glanced at Emily, who was watching Jack with unblinking eyes, her small frame leaning forward as though she wanted to hear every word. Laura crossed her arms, her suspicion showing. "That sounds like the kind of tale someone tells when they don't want to answer where they have really been. How do I know you're not bringing danger to my door?" Her voice trembled with both skepticism and the quiet fear of responsibility for her daughter. Jack did not answer immediately. Instead, he raised one trembling hand and gestured faintly toward the puppy by the fire. "Look closer," he murmured. Laura frowned but moved to the hearth, lifting the towel gently from the small creature. Her breath caught as she saw it, faint red lines etched around the pup's fragile neck, raw impressions where a rope or wire had been pulled tight. The marks told a story no man could fabricate. Laura's skepticism faltered, and for the first time her eyes softened as she looked back at Jack. He had no need to prove himself with words when the truth was written on the small, wounded body of the animal he had fought to save. Silence filled the kitchen for a moment, broken only by the crackle of fire and the pup's soft whimper. Emily, unable to contain herself, leaned closer to Jack, her young voice full of awe. "You saved it," she whispered, her freckles glowing faintly in the morning light. "You didn't let it die out there." Jack turned his head, meeting the gaze of the child who had helped pull him from the snow. In her wide eyes he saw no suspicion, no doubt, only admiration unclouded by the cynicism of adults. His heart ached with both humility and a faint, unfamiliar warmth. He gave a small nod. "I couldn't let it suffer, not again." Rex, sensing the moment, nudged Jack's arm more firmly, wagging his tail once before lying back down against his side. The dog's acceptance was immediate and absolute, the kind of silent acknowledgement only animals could give, as though recognizing a comrade. Laura, watching the scene, felt the tension in her chest loosen. She had been ready to guard her daughter from a dangerous man, but what she saw instead was someone battered, broken, yet still, willing to give what little he had for a life no one else valued. She sighed softly, shaking her head. "You must be a soldier," she murmured, half statement, half question. Jack's eyes flickered, shadowed by memories too heavy to name, and he gave the barest nod. The room warmed with the fire and the weight of what had been shared. Laura ladled broth into a bowl and set it near Jack, watching as he struggled but managed to sip. Emily stayed close, her crutches tucked beneath her chair, her small fingers tracing the edge of the towel around the puppy as though guarding it herself. In that moment, the storm outside was forgotten, and in its place lingered a fragile trust, one born not from words alone but from sacrifice witnessed with their own eyes. Laura still held her doubts, but the marks on the pup's neck and the way Rex pressed against the stranger told her enough. This was no liar, but a man who had already chosen to suffer so another would live. As the morning deepened, Jack leaned back against the pillows Laura had tucked behind him, his breathing steadier, though still shallow. He glanced toward Emily, who met his gaze without fear, and then toward Rex, who had not moved an inch from his side. A faint smile touched his lips, tired but real. He was still a stranger in their home, but in that moment, surrounded by warmth and wary kindness, he was no longer alone. The pale light of dawn spread across Maple Hollow, soft and cold, carrying with it the hush that follows a night of storm. Inside Laura Evans's home, the fire had burned steady through the early hours, keeping the kitchen warm, though the air still smelled faintly of smoke and damp wool. Jack Carter sat at the table, his broad frame hunched forward, shoulders stiff, exhaustion etched into his face. The tiny German Shepherd pup still lay wrapped in a towel beside the hearth, breathing weak but steady. Rex dozed near the door, but every so often his ears twitched, as though he already knew that rest would not last. Jack's mind had not let him sleep, weighed down by what he had seen in the forest and what he had failed to stop. Laura entered quietly, carrying a steaming mug of coffee, her expression watchful. She set it in front of him, then crossed her arms, her protective nature rising again. "If you're thinking of going back out there," she said, her voice firm, "leave Emily here. She's not following you into that mess." Emily, who had been sitting quietly at the table's edge, lowered her gaze but did not protest. At only 5 years old, her spirit was brave, but even she knew her mother's tone left no room for argument. Jack lifted his eyes, meeting Laura's stern look, and nodded once. "She stays," he agreed softly. "This isn't a place for children." Rex rose at the sound of his name being unspoken, padding over to Jack with a low rumble in his throat. The dog's amber eyes shone with an alertness that mirrored Jack's resolve, as though the two had silently agreed that whatever had begun in that forest could not be ignored. Jack stood slowly, his ribs still aching from the beating he had taken, but his will sharper than his pain. He pulled on the worn coat Laura had laid across the chair and glanced toward the window where snow still clung to the glass. The world outside looked deceptively quiet, yet Jack knew danger thrived in silence. The walk back into the forest was heavy with the weight of purpose. Rex padded beside him, paws pressing into the fresh layer of snow, leaving a clear trail as they moved through the trees. The air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of pine and something darker beneath it, an odor of rust and neglect that lingered faintly in the direction they were heading. Jack's breath clouded in the air, his boots crunching against frozen ground, each step echoing in the stillness. He had spent years in uniform, both on foreign soil and in his own country, and he had learned to read the land like a book. The forest now whispered warnings, the hush of birds too quiet, the branches creaking in uneasy rhythm. It took nearly an hour of trudging through drifts before Rex froze, nose low, tail stiff, body quivering with recognition. Jack followed the dog's lead, his eyes narrowing as a shape materialized between the trees. A small cabin, its timbers weathered gray, roof sagging beneath, the weight of snow. It looked abandoned to the casual eye, but the ground outside told another story. Tracks pressed into the frost, some booted, some clawed, and the faint reek of animals carried on the wind. Jack's jaw tightened as he approached, one hand brushing the handle of the knife he kept hidden in his coat, not out of paranoia, but habit. Rex whined low in his throat, pressing closer as though confirming his suspicions. Inside, the air was heavy, almost choking. The door creaked open under Jack's hand, and the smell hit him immediately, a sour stench of urine, rust, and something unmistakably animal. The cabin was nearly empty of furniture, but not of evidence. Against one wall sat a row of iron cages, some bent from struggle, others with latches still locked, chains coiled in piles on the floor, stained with dirt and hair. The wood itself seemed to carry echoes of barking that had long since ceased. Jack's stomach turned, though he had faced worse sights in war, because this cruelty was no accident. It was deliberate, calculated. Rex moved quickly through the space, nose pressed to the ground, circling the cages and sniffing each corner. His tail flicked stiffly, and he let out sharp barks as he pressed his nose against one particular cage, the scent of puppies still clinging to the metal. Jack crouched, brushing his fingers along the bars, and found fur caught in the hinges, fragile strands that spoke of desperate attempts to escape. He pressed his lips into a hard line, anger tightening his chest. "This is where they kept them," he muttered, his voice low, almost to himself. But Rex seemed to answer with a growl that vibrated against the wooden floor. Jack's eyes swept the cabin, searching for anything more tangible than cages and chains. That was when he saw the markings, faint but deliberate, chalked into the rough wooden boards of the far wall. Symbols, crude yet purposeful. Triangles intersected with slashes, circles dotted with arrows, lines drawn in sequences that no child would idly scrawl. He leaned closer, tracing them with his fingertip, recognizing the pattern of a code, not unlike the marks he had once seen in military communications, but here adapted into the crude secrecy of criminals. These were signals, perhaps instructions, places, or times. Whatever they meant, it was proof that this was no random cruelty. It was organized, systematic. For several long minutes, Jack remained in the cabin, cataloging every detail in his mind, knowing he had no camera or notebook, but trusting his soldier's memory. Rex scratched at the door impatiently, eager to move on, yet Jack knew the evidence here was enough to confirm his fear. He stood slowly, his breath uneven, and cast one last look at the cages, the chalk marks, and the empty silence that hung heavy as accusation. Then he closed the door behind him, the stench lingering on his clothes, the memory burning sharper than the cold. By the time they returned to Laura's home, the day was well into afternoon, snow falling in softer flurries now. Emily rushed to the window as soon as she spotted them, her small frame hopping slightly on her crutches, her face alight with relief. Laura met Jack at the door, her expression torn between worry and resignation. Jack lowered his gaze briefly before speaking, his voice weighted. "It's worse than I thought. This isn't just a few men. It's organized. They have places, codes, a system." His words hung in the warm kitchen air, heavy as the snow outside. And though he did not say more, the look in his eyes was enough. This was no small matter, and the danger had only begun to reveal itself. The night settled over Maple Hollow in a heavy silence, the storm gone but the forest still cloaked in mist and frost. Jack Carter moved through the trees with Rex close at his side, his breath steaming in the cold air, his eyes scanning for movement. The cabin he had discovered earlier loomed ahead, its crooked roof framed by the thin glow of the moon. He had returned to watch, to find proof that what he had seen was not only memory, but an ongoing crime. Rex padded low and quiet, every muscle taut, his ears pricked toward the faintest sound. The forest carried a stillness that was not natural, as though waiting for something to break. Jack crouched behind a thicket, watching the shadowed outline of the cabin. No lights glowed within, no fire smoke drifted from the chimney, yet the silence felt staged, too deliberate. He whispered to Rex, "Stay sharp," though the dog already stood rigid, his body quivering with tension. Jack's soldier instincts stirred uneasily, warning him that what looked empty might be far from abandoned. He shifted slightly, adjusting his stance, scanning the trees. That was when the sound came. Boots crunching on snow, faint but too close. Before he could react, figures emerged from the darkness. 4 men, rough-built, their faces shadowed beneath caps and scarves, fanned out quickly, circling him. One carried a crowbar, another a heavy chain, while the tallest brandished a flashlight that cut a cruel beam across Jack's face. Their leader, broad-shouldered with a scar tracing down his jaw, sneered at the sight of him. "I told you we'd deal with you," he hissed, voice low and venomous. Jack's muscles tightened, his hand brushing the knife inside his coat, but the numbers were against him. Rex growled, teeth bared, fur bristling in defiance, standing as a wall between his master and the threat. Back at the Evans home, warmth glowed in the hearth, but Emily sat restless, clutching her crutches as though they anchored her. She had watched the door for hours, waiting for Rex and Jack, her small heart pounding with dread. Laura tried to reassure her, yet worry lined the mother's face as well, though she masked it with calm words. Emily pressed her lips together, refusing to be comforted, her young mind sharp with a fear that would not quiet. "Something's wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mama, we have to call the police." Her determination, fragile yet fierce, filled the room, leaving Laura no answer but silence. The sound carried faintly across the night, a distant thud, a muffled shout, and then the low echo of barking. Emily froze, her wide eyes darting to the window as though she could see through the storm-thick forest. Her crutches clattered softly as she moved, grabbing the phone from the counter with hands that shook but did not falter. Laura tried to stop her, but Emily's voice rose, clear and desperate. "If we don't call, they'll die out there." She punched the numbers with trembling fingers, the phone heavy in her small grip, but her voice steady when the dispatcher answered. "This is Maple Hollow," she said, forcing the words out. "The old cabin in the woods by Miller's Creek. Please, send help. Now." In the forest, Jack was shoved back against a tree, his ribs flaring with pain as the scarred man pressed closer, chain rattling in his hand. "You should have kept walking," the thug growled. Jack spat blood into the snow, glaring back with the iron steadiness of a soldier who had seen worse. But before the blow could fall, Rex lunged. With a snarl that tore through the silence, the German shepherd slammed into the attacker, teeth sinking into the man's wrist. The chain clattered into the snow as the man screamed, thrashing, while Rex held firm, growling deep and furious. Chaos erupted. Another man swung the crowbar, but Jack ducked, his training guiding him even through exhaustion. He countered with his knife, forcing the man back, but the numbers pressed hard. A fist struck his shoulder, sending him reeling, while a boot connected with his side. He fought like a man cornered, but the odds threatened to break him. Through the melee, Rex never faltered, launching at one attacker after another, a blur of muscle and fury, his devotion as fierce as his strength. Yet, for every move they made, more blows came, and Jack felt the noose tightening. Back at the Evans home, Emily still clutched the phone, her breath ragged but her voice unbroken. The dispatcher's questions blurred, but she repeated the location again and again, determined not to falter. Laura held her shoulders, torn between fear and pride as her daughter, only 5, carried a burden far too heavy for her years. The sound of sirens finally pierced the night, faint at first but growing, and Emily's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "They're coming," she whispered, as though to herself, as though to Rex, who was not there but who would hear her in spirit. In the forest, headlights slashed through the trees, red and blue flashing against snow. The roar of engines shattered the dark as police SUVs burst into the clearing, tires skidding across the frozen ground. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn, shouts cutting through the chaos. The men who had circled Jack froze, curses spilling as the reality of law crashed down upon them. Rex snarled one last time before releasing his hold, standing protectively over Jack as the police surged forward. The traffickers tried to scatter, but the beam of flashlights and the command of rifles gave them no escape. Jack sank to his knees, his body battered but his spirit unbroken, Rex pressing against him with steady force, both of them gasping in the sudden flood of safety. Officers moved past, securing the cabin, forcing open cages where more frightened dogs whined and barked. In the flashing lights and the echo of handcuffs clinking, the nightmare began to break. Jack closed his eyes, relief crashing over him, and for a moment he thought of Emily. Small, fragile Emily, whose courage had carried far more weight than she knew. The night's chaos gave way to morning, and the first light of dawn broke gently over Maple Hollow, painting the snow in shades of silver and gold. Police vehicles still idled at the forest's edge, their red and blue lights now dimming in the daylight, while officers finished their work among the shadows of the trees. The men who had haunted the cabin with cages and cruelty were now handcuffed, their faces grim as they were led into custody. The sound of barking no longer echoed with fear but with relief as officers carefully carried whimpering dogs from the decrepit cabin into warm vehicles bound for the rescue shelter. Jack Carter stood at the perimeter, his body aching but his resolve firm, watching as justice finally took shape. Beside him, Rex sat with a soldier's stillness, his amber eyes reflecting the quiet triumph of survival. Emily clung to her crutches as she arrived with Laura, her cheeks flushed with both fear and pride. The officers who recognized her role had already begun whispering words that traveled quickly among the crowd. "The little hero," one called her softly, tipping his cap as she passed. Emily's small shoulders lifted, uncertain of the title, but the determination in her eyes betrayed no doubt about what she had done. She had faced the fear of silence, dialed the phone, and spoken the truth when it mattered most. For her, it was only what needed to be done, yet to others, it was the courage of a child shining through a storm. Jack looked at her with quiet admiration, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint smile despite his bruises. Laura approached Jack with caution that had begun to melt into something warmer. She had doubted him, judged him by his rough exterior and the danger that had followed him to her doorstep. But now she saw him for what he was, a man who had chosen compassion over safety, who had nearly given his life to shelter a creature no one else would have noticed. Her eyes softened as she spoke. "You could have walked away. No one would have blamed you. But you didn't." Jack shook his head slowly, his voice rough. "I couldn't. Some things you don't walk away from." Laura's lips pressed into a faint smile, her guarded heart slowly opening to trust. The rescued dogs were gathered at the roadside, shivering but alive, their eyes wide as volunteers from the local shelter wrapped them in blankets. Each whimper was a sound of both pain and relief, a reminder of cruelty endured, but also of the second chance now given. Emily knelt carefully beside one small carrier, her metallic prosthetic glinting in the light as she reached out to touch the nose of a trembling terrier inside. "You're safe now," she whispered, her words tender and resolute. Rex leaned down beside her, sniffing gently, his tail wagging with approval. It was as though he, too, understood the weight of what had been accomplished. Jack stood as a silent witness, the officers acknowledging him not as a stranger, but as the man whose testimony would soon matter. He would be called upon in court, his words carrying the authority of both a soldier and a survivor, to ensure the men responsible could never return to these woods. Yet, as he watched Emily stroking the frightened dogs, he felt the weight of his own journey shift. He had come here alone, carrying the scars of a life lived in service, and now he found himself bound to a small family by nothing more than shared courage and compassion. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the beginnings of belonging. The smallest of the rescued creatures, the German shepherd pup Jack had shielded with his own body, was placed back into Emily's arms. Its tiny frame quivered, but its eyes opened wide to meet hers, and she laughed softly, a sound that brightened the winter air. Laura watched, her expression tender, as the girl held the fragile life against her chest, her crutches steadying her but her spirit soaring higher. Jack's heart swelled at the sight, his pain momentarily forgotten. "He was meant to be with you," he murmured, and Emily nodded as though she had known it all along. The officers loaded the last of the cages, their work nearly done, but the story had already begun to travel among them. A soldier who refused to let go, a little girl who dared to speak, and a dog who never wavered. One officer, a man in his 40s with kind eyes, paused as he passed Jack. "Sometimes it takes people like you to remind the rest of us why we fight these battles." Jack gave a tired nod, uncomfortable with the praise but understanding its truth. He looked down at Rex, who pressed his head against his leg, and felt a silent acknowledgement pass between them. They had fought as partners, and they had not failed. Back at the Evans home later that day, the fire once again warmed the kitchen, but now laughter mingled with the crackling flames. Laura set food on the table, her gestures no longer hesitant but welcoming. Emily sat with the pup curled in her lap, already naming him with the earnest excitement of a child given a gift too precious to describe. Rex lay stretched nearby, eyes half closed but ears still alert, content to share his space with the fragile newcomer. Jack sat at the table, his frame tired but his heart lighter, and when Laura glanced at him there was no suspicion left in her eyes. "Stay here," she said quietly. "At least until you're strong again." Jack hesitated, unused to being offered shelter, but Emily's hopeful gaze left him no room to refuse. He nodded slowly, the simple word, "thank you," carrying the weight of years spent wandering alone. In that moment, a new family was forming, not by blood, but by choice, by courage, and by kindness. The soldier, the widow, the child, and the dogs, bound not by obligation, but by shared survival and trust. Outside, the storm was over, and the snow that once buried the world in silence now glistened with the promise of renewal. And so, in the quiet of Maple Hollow, a truth lingered like the morning light. Heroes do not always wear capes or medals. Sometimes they are a battered veteran collapsed in the snow, a little girl with a broken body but an unbroken voice, and a loyal dog who never leaves your side. And sometimes, hope is no larger than a puppy trembling in your arms, reminding you that even in the coldest night, compassion can spark a dawn that feels entirely new. In the end, this story reminds us that true heroism is often quiet and unseen. It is not measured by fame or recognition, but by compassion, by the willingness to give of ourselves for those who cannot protect themselves. Jack, Emily, and Rex showed that even in the harshest storm, kindness and silent sacrifice can shine brighter than fear. Their courage is a call for us to believe that every act of mercy, no matter how small, can change the world for the better. If this touched your heart, share this story with someone who needs hope and write your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss stories of faith and resilience. May God bless you and keep you in light and peace.